Okay, before we get cranking on the command line here, I want to cover the absolute basics that you need to understand before you just jump in and start doing stuff. This is going to save you some pain right away. Okay, so what is a command line interface? What's the shell? How does all this stuff work? Basically, it's an environment where you type in a command at a prompt. This is the shell prompt that you see here. It's waiting for me to tell it what to do. So what you'll do is type something in. The first command everyone learns is list, ls. You hit enter, and it tells the machine, hey, I'd like you to run the ls command. It goes and finds that, runs the command. The command lists the current directory that you're sitting in and returns that information to you, and then immediately returns you back to the shell. So the cycle is, it waits for some input, you give it some input and hit enter. Output is returned, it can also take the form of an error, and then command is sort of returned to you with another shell prompt. Okay? So this cycle is sort of how it works. Now the concept of directories, folders as they're called in the Mac world, it still applies here. Folders still exist in Linux, but working in a command line environment, you basically keep the structure of the system in your head as you move through it. So instead of seeing icons for everything, you have to type ls, and then you see what directories, and in this case files, are in the directory that you're sitting in. If you want to see what directory you're sitting in, you can use pwd, print working directory, and it says, oh, you're in home Dave. So home Dave contains this. In Windows, you might be used to the slashes going the other way. Don't worry too much about it. In Linux and Unix, the slashes go to the right. That's the slash key that's near your pinky if you're on an American or a US keyboard layout. So we're going to go deeper into the file system later, but just so you know, these are the very basics of how working in the shell works. I'm going to cover just a couple commands so that you're not completely lost right away. So if I want to change directory into, let's say, one of these directories which we see here, desktop for example, the command for that is cd, change directory. If you start typing desktop, you could type out the whole thing, but you can be lazy. And if you can be lazy, you probably should be lazy as a sysadmin. I mean that in the best way possible. Hit tab, and if there's only one choice, it should auto-complete. If there's more than one choice, like if I just type D, it could still be desktop, documents, or downloads. 2 tabs will give you the choices that you've narrowed it down to so far. So if I keep typing des, and then hit tab again, it'll auto-complete to desktop. Just keep that in mind. You're going to save yourself a whole lot of typing that way. And if you're going to do this for a career, you're going to type hundreds of thousands and millions of keystrokes over your lifetime, which will all take a toll on your body and your poor joints and hands and elbows and shoulders. So be lazy. Okay, so we're now sitting in desktop. We can check, again, using the print working directory command, which will tell us where we are. It's actually not a command like the others, but we'll get to that later. So we're sitting in home, Dave, and now we've changed directory with cd to desktop. Fantastic. Now, if we want to go back, we could type cd home Dave, and that brings us back to where we started. But we can do this in a couple different ways. We could also type cd tilde. That's shift and the top leftmost key on a US English layout. This is short, it's just a shortcut for the current user's home directory. So you can see on the left here, my username is Dave, and this machine's name is Tutorial Linux. That's what I named the virtual machine when I created it. So this simply says, hey, take the current user that I am, that's Dave, and go to that user's home directory. So if we run this, you can see we're back in our home directory. So if we go back to the desktop, back where we were sitting before, another way to go back would be the ... shortcut. So what this basically means is up a directory. You can see that also brings us back. If we run it again, which, by the way, you can run command, the previous command again by simply hitting up the up arrow on your keyboard will scroll through, and then the down will come back. So this goes up through your history, command history. Running this again will actually bring you to home. You can already see it on the shell prompt, right? This has changed. It's showing us where we are on the system. So username, @hostname, and location in the file system. This is just a bash prompt. Other shells, there are other shells that display things a little bit differently, but you don't need to worry about that now. So I just said up a directory and down a directory. What does that mean? I've got a whole course on bash and the Linux file system. You can check that out. It's actually free on YouTube. But I'm going to explain sort of just the basic theory you need here because this is a practical course. When I say up a directory, I mean if I'm sitting in desktop, up one directory is one directory closer to the beginning here, which is called root. The first slash is called root. If I'm sitting in desktop and I go up a directory, then I'm sitting in the Dave directory. If I go up again, I'm sitting in home. If I go down from home, I go into the Dave directory. If I go down from Dave, well, I have the choice of which of these I want to go into, but that's down. So away from root, which is sort of the beginning of the system, is down, and towards root is up. Just to make this obvious, we can list. If we don't pass any arguments to list, it simply lists the current directory we're in. An argument is something that you type after the command. So here, list is the command, and slash for root is the argument. So if we list root, this is simply going to list out the root directory. Likewise, if we list home Dave, we get exactly what we expect, the same thing we got when listing while sitting in that directory. If this is a little bit of a mind trip, it's okay. Just play around with this. Really just practically using this, just kind of go up and down directories, list different directories that you find, use the pwd, I'll say command, to check where you are on the file system, and just get a little bit comfortable moving up and down your file system. A few final comments about basic command line or shell skills. In bash, by default, if you're typing, let's say blah if you're typing a line, and you realize, oh, I need something at the beginning of this line, Control A will get you to the beginning of the line, and Control E will get you back to the end. So Control A to the beginning and Control E for end. You'll use these a lot, again, to be lazy and save time and keystrokes. If I enter a command that it has no idea about, that Linux just doesn't understand or can't find, you'll see something like this. This is an error. Don't freak out. Read the errors that you get, and they'll help you kind of figure out what's going on. I already mentioned up for scrolling through your shell history, the up arrow. You can use that. The last thing I want to mention is comments. So this isn't a real command. A comment, both in Linux shell scripting and in most programming languages, comments are things that are really just made for humans to read and not for your machine, your programming language, or anything else to execute, right? So they're not made for your computer to execute, they're made simply to be read. You'll see this a lot in guides and tutorials. This is sort of there to help humans understand what's going on with the commands. If you need to comment something out, it simply won't run, right? This is not producing an error the same way that actually running that produces an error. When you have this hash or number symbol at the very beginning of a line, that line is not executed by your shell, by your command line environment, by the interpreter. I'm deliberately using multiple terms to talk about this. I know it's really confusing, there's a lot of terminology, but just have multiple words for the same thing in your head for now, and we'll get into the details later. So this can be called a command line interface. It's the general term, right? It's not a graphical interface, so it's a command line interface. It's a shell, because we're running a program that runs as a shell, and a shell is something that does that thing we described. It takes some input from you, executes it, and returns some output. And an interpreter is sort of the program behind the shell that's actually figuring out what to do with your commands. It's sort of an interpreter. And that can apply to a shell like bash, which is the shell we're using, or it can apply to a programming language interpreter. For example, if you're using a programming language, you might have heard of Ruby or Python or PHP. Those are languages that have an interpreter which in real time essentially figures out what you'd like to execute, that is the line you've typed in, and then interprets that line. These things are all sort of related. Again, you don't need perfect understanding of all this stuff right now. Just slowly getting you used to all this crazy terminology that's going to be flying around if you're doing this for a living, or if you're working in any professional capacity. Okay, I think we've done well for right now. These are the very basics that you need for working on the shell. I really recommend, I know it's theoretical, you have to practice this stuff. So please take some time, practice. There's going to be a little quiz on the things we covered just now. Make sure you become comfortable with these things, and the rest of your life for the rest of this course will be much, 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 much easier. Not that you won't understand what's going on, but you'll simply be much more nimble on the keyboard. You'll get things done faster. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.